So, coming to you, sir, could you please tell us about your much awaited book, War on Gaza, the concept of genocidal self defense?
Yeah, well, this was basically a political pamphlet that I created because a friend in Han Yunis basically said, please lift up your voice. And after the events of October 7th and Israel's response, I was thinking of writing something and drawing something, but I wasn't exactly sure. My own thoughts weren't clear. Right away, I was getting phone calls from news organizations that wanted my hot take on it. And I didn't have a hot take other than horror. I mean, I'm not an analyst, really, and I didn't feel comfortable even talking about what was going on.
So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It is almost night in India, but it is 8:30 in the morning in Portland, Oregon. You should know where it is. I'm not going to Google it for you. So, this is Middle East Insights, and I'm Dr. Shubhda Chaudhary, the founder of it. We are a volunteer-based organization with members from South Asia, Middle East, and Africa. And today we are very privileged to host Joe Sacco, though he does not need an introduction. But I'm going to read a small brief that for decades, Joe Sacco has redefined what journalism or comics journalism can be, using the medium of comics to plunge readers into the lived realities of those caught in war zones. From the Israeli crimes in Palestine and Footnotes in Gaza, where the Zionists really wrote him a lot of love letters in return, to the horrors of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, in Safe Area Goražde, and The Fixer. Sacco's work also includes his own autobiographical comic work, which is Yahoo, and one very interesting piece that he did, which was Bumf. That is often not, talked about, which I find, the people's jacuzzi and all of that very interesting. Sacco's work has consistently paired meticulous research with gut-wrenching art. His unique style not only documents events but humanizes them, placing individual voices at the forefront of historical and political turmoil. We also have with us my oldest, very near and dear friend who is right now doing an illustration as I can see it. His name is Somesh, and I will attach the link of his work. He recently also displayed his work at Comic-Con in Delhi. So coming to you, sir, could you please tell us about your much awaited book, War on Gaza, the concept of genocidal self-defense?
Yeah, well, this was basically a political pamphlet that I created because a friend in Han Yunis basically said, please lift up your voice. And after the events of October 7th and Israel's response, I was thinking of writing something and drawing something, but I wasn't exactly sure. I mean, my own thoughts weren't clear. Right away, I was getting phone calls from news organizations that wanted my hot take on it. And I didn't have a hot take other than horror. I mean, I'm not an analyst, really, and I wasn't, I didn't feel comfortable even talking about what was going on initially. I was just, as a human organism, revolted by what was going on. My thoughts took some time to coalesce, but when my friend in Han Yunis, about a few weeks into the war, wrote to me and said, please lift up your voice, I went from just sort of making doodles and writing some notes to just concentrating and focusing and just starting. Sometimes starting is what helps you think in a way. So I did this pamphlet, and the first illustration I did was of these bombs stuck in these shrouds. That image came to me, and I thought of the concept of, well, what's going on? Israel claims it's self-defense. So what is the definition of self-defense? Does it include permitting or committing genocide? And it's a question I'm throwing at the reader. You know, what is self-defense? What is justifiable self-defense? And what crosses a line into something much beyond that? So the word genocidal self-defense, or those words came to me, and obviously they're meant ironically. But, you know, really it's for the reader to sort of contemplate this whole thing, because we've heard, especially in the West, that it's self-defense. Israel has the right to defend itself. Well, does it have the right to commit genocide? And if self-defense has such a broad definition as to include that, then we're really at a place where words sort of lose their significance, or at least they become completely muddled.
That's true. And I hope your friend is safe, sir, right now.
He personally is safe. After a while, he managed to get to Cairo with his family. But even that is really, that's really about having a bit of money to get out. At that time, you know, you could pay a certain amount. It was generally $5,000 for an adult or $2,500 for a child to get out. So if you had means, or some means, perhaps you could manage this. But then, of course, it's not just his wife and children, it's his mother, his brothers. I mean, then you begin to think of everyone else that you want to get out. So he's in Cairo, along with about 100,000 other Palestinians that managed to make it out of Gaza. Not living in the best of conditions, obviously. I mean, the Egyptian government isn't, I mean, they can stay, but they're not permitted to do all kinds of things. So it's not an easy thing either for them.
The difference over in this book would be that you do not have the agency to be in Gaza.
That's right.
West Bank.
That's right. And, you know, my first impulse is to want to report. I would rather talk to people, hear what they have to say, and listen, and try to convey what they have to say, and then see for myself. And that's impossible for a foreign journalist. I mean, obviously, there are some very brave Palestinian journalists who are doing this job, and many are being killed. Some were just killed a couple of days ago, 5 of them. So, I mean, journalism is going on in Gaza, but my first impulse is also to see. I'm a journalist, or that's how I think of myself in this particular case. But there was no way of doing that. So, like, I had to think, what would my response be? And I realized I had to basically fall into this essay format. And I have had a history of doing satirical work. So that's the spin I gave it. I didn't want to write outright polemics, because even though I can agree with polemics, I don't find them artistic generally. And that artist part of me needs to feel like I'm bringing the reader along and not just sort of hitting them over the head with a sledgehammer.
Yes, that is, in fact, this shawl that I'm wearing, I got it from West Bank.
Okay.
And I have most of my friends in West Bank. And satire is a part of their daily lives too. For example, when Trump won, they're like, Habibti, 2 days, no bombing. So I was like, wait, let him come on. So obviously they know what lies ahead, but the humor is they're much more courageous than me. Sometimes it feels when I talk to them it's the reverse. They're consoling me. That is the context that happens. My next question to you, sir, is that, for example, your work Bump, which questioned a lot of the intricacies of the American administration, and portrayed it. It was the historical weight of it was not accepted in the light of reality. Do you fear that the kind of growing division and so much of uh, such a fragile ecosystem over there in US, especially now with Trump coming, do you think that when you use words like genocide or ethnic cleansing, there might be a cancel culture against you?
Well, I think there is partly a cancel culture that is prevalent now, but I think everyone already knows what I think. I've been writing about or drawing about this issue for a long time, so I don't feel like anyone who's wanted to cancel me would have canceled me a long time ago. I think it's harder for people who are sort of finding their own voice in this, like students, because there are threats against them. I mean, to be honest, I'm relatively well established now. I'm not beholden to anyone. My publishers support me. I don't have to find a job. Do you know? And if you're a student, if you're 20 years old, about to graduate, and they're saying, well, maybe you can't graduate, or maybe we're going to expel you, and companies are very forcefully saying, if you've been arrested for in a pro-Palestinian demonstration, or if we find something on your social media, you won't get a job with us. I mean, if those kinds of threats probably are more difficult for people who are starting out. I personally am not worried about it. Of course, people are going to say that, people would even accuse me of being an anti-Semite. I mean, there's no evidence for that, and I'm not. But this is just sort of the typical thing. I mean, in the end, that's the final brush that they'll try to, get you with, is you're an anti-Semite, so that's the conversation ends there. But, unfortunately, I mean, anti-Semitism means something, but unfortunately, it's beginning to sort of be a rite of passage for a lot of people. And that's unfortunate because anti-Semitism does mean something.
Yeah, and it's not about just racism against Jews. Anti-Semitism has the history of being against the Semitic languages, Arabic, right. Hebrew, Aramaic, which is still spoken by Lebanese Christians. All of them are Semites.
Right. That's something that often doesn't come into that.
Yeah,
come into that conversation.
It doesn't. And what also I wanted to ask you is that why there is this constant self-critique of you yourself in your comics?
I mean, I guess I sort of believe in that Dostoevskian notion that we're all responsible. We're all guilty, in fact, on some level. And it's not necessarily bewailing, my privilege or anything like that. It's more about situating myself in history and situating myself where I am. And, that's important to do. But self-critique is just part of diffusing certain things. Let's put it this way. I'm a Libra. I'm always going to sort of be thinking about, this angle or that angle and what it all means. So, it's part of, it's part of humor in a way. It's part of how I feel. I'm constantly analyzing myself. It also comes out of this feeling that as a journalist, it's very difficult, I think, to actually be objective. And it's trying to understand my own role in journalism, where I come from and where I'm going, and how I'm seeing things through the filters that I've grown up with, that are just part of me. It's not necessarily saying that you can dismantle those filters, but it's just recognizing those filters. And so that involves some self-critique, and not just self-critique, but critique of your own society, or critique of, in my case, just Western values.
Yeah.
So that's an ongoing process. I'm not going to solve all that, sort out all that. I'm not going to denounce the West entirely. My thinking now is like, what about the West is worth saving? What is it about the West that I still hold near and dear? And there are some things, there are some things.
Yes, there are, the kind of, at least the, I don't know how to explain it, but the certain kind of, not privilege, but the certain kind of, the privilege of freedom of speech. Even if that is lacking in many of the context in today's space. And it is a difficult time for many citizens all across the world. As you have, speaking about you being a Libra, you share your birthday with Mahatma Gandhi.
I know, and also Groucho Marx, so that isn't that bad.
Yes. And my question is that how did your own personal journey of hailing from Malta, growing up in Australia with friends who were European, in the context of, the aftermath of the Second World War, then traveling to Europe, settling in US. You also do NGO work in India. How, over the period of time, if you would have looked at yourself when you were starting out?
How would I have looked at myself when I was starting out? When I was starting out, well, let me correct you on something. I didn't do NGO work in India. I did some journalism work in India. So that's one thing. But, when I started out, the first time I became conscious of this is what I want to do with my life, it was about journalism. I was in the United States. I was on the school newspaper in high school, and then I became the editor of the school newspaper. And like a light bulb went off in my head, and I realized I like talking to people. I actually like finding out what they think. And I always volunteered or insisted that I do the stories about like foreign exchange students, because that was a world I didn't know. They were coming from usually Europe or Australia or places like that, but I didn't know those places. Maybe I knew Australia a bit, but I was curious. And to me, I realized that if you say you're a journalist, if you come with these credentials, then you can sort of talk to anyone. I mean, whether it's a general or a prince, or if it's, someone who has absolutely nothing that's inviting you into their hut. To me, it's all a privilege in a way, just to see humanity in all its forms and in the full hierarchy of humanity. So I loved that. I studied journalism. I got a degree from the University of Oregon. But when I got out of school, it was very difficult to find a journalism job that was remotely satisfying. I mean, there are many journalism jobs that are not about reporting. They're about, you work for an association and you're basically writing newsletters or puff pieces about that association. And I was involved in some of that, and I hated it. So I basically thought I was leaving journalism behind and falling back on comics or drawing, which was just an early love of mine. To make a long story short, I basically moved to Berlin. I gave up journalism. I started doing rock and roll posters, album covers, things not related to journalism at all. But through comics, I basically found my way back to journalism. And that's because I was still interested in the world and still interested in talking to people. And I became a little obsessed with what was going on in the Middle East and what was going on with the Palestinians. This was in the late 80s, early 90s. And then because I was living in Berlin, that was quite close to that region, and I decided to go to see for myself and do some comics about it. I wasn't sure what that all meant. I wasn't sure what I was doing, to be honest. I knew I was going to do some comics about my own experiences there, but I think because I had that journalistic training, that's how I began looking at everything. I began looking at everything sort of through the eyes of a journalist, seeing how to go about, you know, getting a complete picture of, or as a complete picture as was possible for me, of the lives of people under occupation, sort of putting it all together. That training just kicked in, you know.
Were you able to organically process it? Because in West Bank, I couldn't. It took me a couple of days to understand, I still can't process. And even though, there's a much more historical closeness between India and Palestine, and in terms of, like the languages and the words borrowed and everything, the cultural context, but I was not able to process it. When I thought about settlements, I thought about settlements being outside, the apartheid wall being somewhere different, but all of it was so visceral. It felt as if I was in a dystopian nightmare. And for you, how it was in Gaza and West Bank?
Well, yeah, it was disorienting because you can read a lot about it, but it's going and sort of getting when you go, you actually get a sense of it. And you also get a sense of what really matters to people. Sometimes you read things and that from certain points of view, even points of view of activists, and you realize when you get there, well, it's not quite like that, or something else is going on, or there are conflicts within the community. You begin to sort of understand things. But if it took you a couple of days to get a sense of it, it took me months, like a couple of months to get a sense of it. I still, every time I've been back, it's still learning more, trying to take on, what I'm seeing. But yes, it felt dystopian even at the time of the first Intifada, which is nothing. This is before the wall went up in the West Bank. This is when people could still, if they had the right permits or card, they could travel back and forth. There were a lot of people I know who were working in Israel. They were living in the West Bank. All this is basically either incredibly restricted or gone at this point. So when I was there, it was sort of a simpler time on some level. I won't say it feels almost quaint with what's going on today, because it was a brutal time also. But as you yourself have seen, as everyone who's listening this sees, things have escalated now to, if we were talking about, if I felt it was dystopic in the early 1990s, imagine what it's like now. Imagine what it's like in Gaza. I can't really imagine it.
Yeah, it's like we are consuming and normalizing, and we can't process it. We shouldn't process it, as you said. And there are two stories that come to my mind. Like, for example, in Jericho, I went around 7 to 8 years back. So there was a young girl who was 18 years old. And just, like small talk, I started talking with her about where are your parents? How are your parents? And she said she hasn't met her parents for a very long time. And I was like, why? So she told me that she was born in her grandmother's house in Jerusalem. After the delivery, the time permit for the parents was over. They had to go back to Jericho. The child grew with the grandmother. And the second thing that really tore me specifically was, I'm a Hindu, and I was able to go to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But the Palestinians who were our guides, at like both girls and boys, they haven't been to Al-Aqsa ever. And these were two stories. My friend right now tells that in Ramallah there are 12 checkpoints now entering Ramallah. And every day at the dinner table, the family, the parents, they who are like in the 70s, the only conversation that they have in the dinner table is, if there's a bombing, we'll die here. We are never leaving.
Yeah, I mean, that resonates with a lot of what I saw, what I felt, and what I heard when I was there. Because it's not just about, it isn't, actually, it's not just about the bombing and all the things you associate with warfare. There's sort of a day-to-day series of humiliations that Palestinians undergo. There are just many degradations, the checkpoints, all those sorts of things that people have to negotiate that, I don't. I have freedom of movement. I can go downtown anytime I please, but they have to think about things. They have to think about, well, how long is it going to get through this checkpoint? Am I going to get to class on time? Often people are stopped, they're searched. I mean, I saw people being humiliated all the time in the early 1990s. And if you think about Gaza now, again, it's not just about the bombing. Imagine the humiliation of living so cramped, having to worry about, the most minute details of bodily functions and how to go about things, how to bathe, how to stay clean. I mean, it's really more than people have to think about that a bit too. Sometimes it's not just about shrapnel and bullets.
Yeah, and it's much more. It's the alienation of the alienation that has been created by the daily media portrayal of, and the social media portrayal of the genocide, creating a certain kind of normalization of it. Is horrendous. And on one of the Twitter spaces, one of the Gazan journalists was telling that how frantically he's writing his name all over his body parts. And the reason was this, that if he's bombed, his body will be shattered into pieces so that his loved ones, by his name written on his body parts, are at least able to assemble him together. And that was something which was so foreign in thought, to imagine death in such a way.
Yeah, well, it's a level of fatalism I think we have a hard time getting our head around. You're really right, though. It's as the genocide has gone on for more than a year. We don't know how long it's going to keep going. This is going to keep unrolling in the future. We're getting, I mean, in general, I think the public is getting used to it. It's becoming sort of a white noise. And that works to Israel's benefit. It works to the benefit of all those in the United States that support it. Because even if you read a paper like The Guardian, which has been relatively good about talking about some of these issues for a mainstream press, if you the story in Gaza has basically and in Palestine has basically begin dropping down the ranks of headlines. So you don't. Recently I looked at the webpage and I couldn't find any new article about what was going on in Gaza, because now 30 people killed, 60 people killed. Apparently it's not enough to sort of raise an eyebrow.
Yeah.
But that's where we are. We are getting brutalized.
Yeah.
Because we are getting used to this.
And the worst impact of that is that in the longer period of time, today it's the Palestinians, tomorrow it will be someone else. And the same kind of apathy has permeated so much into us. It will reflect in other horrendous crimes. Like no one is talking about Sudan, for example.
Right.
No one is talking about what is happening in Nigeria. No one is talking about there's a certain kind of colonial discourse which is there, even though I believe that even the entire idea of being objective, be it as an academic or as a journalist, it's a very colonial idea. Objectivity is a facade.
I think so. I think that's right. Because then really what you end up doing if you're lazy, and journalists can be lazy, is just, let's just quote the spokesperson. Okay, I'll find out I'll see what's going on here, but in the end, let's just muddy the waters with a spokesperson's lies. I mean, that's kind of objective journalism sort of allows for that. And real reporting has to be about finding out, getting as close to what you can call the truth as possible. That might be an impossibility on some level, but as close as possible.
Yeah.
And objectivity is can become part of the construct of colonial narratives. It's a framework for it.
And there is very prominent academic Asal Ragd, who actually on Twitter every day she corrects the headlines of the Western newspapers every day. And Matt Miller and his, the way he is completely the rebuttal that he has to face every day, and he doesn't have an answer most of the times. And there are so many cartoons on him demonizing him because he's being very, very bad at diplomacy at all. And the point then comes to, there is a little Palestine in Chicago with 85,000, 90,000 Palestinians staying there. And in one of the TRT documentaries, I was watching it, and what really jolted me was the American aid agencies, where out of 1,000 kids, they're able to save around 6 to 7 get permits to go to Chicago. And all these kids, like out of 1,000, there are like 7. But anyway, there are 7, there are 8, then nothing. And they came completely, someone is amputated, in the hand side or the leg side or on a wheelchair. No one was able-bodied. Every child who is 12 to 15 years old or 7 years old was operated upon, most often in the kitchen without anesthesia by a doctor. And what made me, and there were so many Palestinians from the diaspora waiting with the flags and flowers and red roses to welcome them. And that jolted me. It was a beautiful scene. There was a celebrity welcome to these kids, but it was very painful to watch it. And many of them might not be able to go back. Ever.
Right.
And these are in the name of maybe Islamophobia, in the name of racism, in the name of patronizing. There is a certain kind of dialectics, specifically, any kind of... once a Palestinian told me that when 2 elephants fight, I asked him on 8th of October. He said, when 2 elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. He was not pro-Hamas.
Yeah.
And over the period of time around you in US, how, and specifically as you keep traveling, how do you see the world changing in terms of action, not only in terms of words, but in action towards doing any change on the ground?
Well, I think most of the action has been with younger people. I think what's changing is for university students, and I think Jewish university students have been at the forefront of some of this, is actually thinking about another narrative they're not accepting the standard narrative anymore. I mean, they can see with their eyes. You don't need the filter of journalists to look at, what's readily available on social media to see the horror of what's going on. And I think there's been sort of a impulse just to find that so revolting. And after that, and I think that's absolutely valid, but after that comes, I think, this self-analysis, education, and I think that's what some of these younger people are doing.
Yeah.
But of course, I'm optimistic about that. But I sort of caution myself a bit too and say, well, these are university students and they've been reading Frantz Fanon and they've been reading Edward Said in their classes. And they're also seeing that their school administrations, despite what they're reading, are coming down hard on them because now they're interested in praxis now. So we've been reading this. Well, then if we've been reading this and analyzing and talking about it, well, now it's happening in real life. What are we going to do? This is what the university should be cultivating, but the administrations don't. The administration of the schools doesn't like this. So they're getting an education in how things sort of really work.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
but of course, again, I caution I tell myself not to get too optimistic about what changes that can happen here in a place like the United States, because there's a focus on these students, but what about a lot of other younger people that don't have access to this education or aren't thinking these things or just have a completely different mindset? There might be many, many more. We just hear about university students because they're always in the front of things.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't. Obviously, if America changed its policies in the Middle East, it would have an immediate impact. If America stopped sending weapons to Israel, that the genocide would basically dry up. Israel would have to sort of think, well, how are we going to get along with our neighbors? We can't bomb them into submission anymore. So what are we going to actually do here? How are we going to figure this out? How are we going to live with people without bombing them? They would come to some conclusions about that. But the power structure is still very heavily weighted in a certain direction here, not just about Israel, Palestine, but about everything, about almost everything. Everything's about money. It's about capitalism.
Yeah.
It's about keeping the resources flowing. It's about consumption. And so how do you change those things? How do you, whether it's Trump or Biden, I mean, honestly, okay, Trump seems worse, but really, I mean, Biden, to me, we're committing a genocide. The United States is committing a genocide. Biden has allowed that to happen or has facilitated it and is part of it. So I don't get my hopes up or down whether the Democrats win or the Republicans lose or whatever it is. To me, this is the United States. This is a organic project. And even if you start scratching at a Democrat, they have some of the same damn prejudices as any Republican will have.
Yeah.
They think the same ways.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's two sides of the same coin.
It is. I mean, how many times have you heard Democrats talking about how the United States is the indispensable nation? We're Americans. We can do anything. I mean, people actually believe it here.
Mostly because they don't know beyond Canada and Mexico.
Yeah, and we might take them over too. Yeah. So I don't know. It's that's why university students are interesting, because they are trying to find out what's going on. Again, they're questioning this whole narrative about exceptionalism. So let's see what they can do. But I'm not sure if this is where things are going to be sorted out. I don't know how things are going to be sorted out. I don't even have solutions that I can spew off, and tell this is the way it's going to go or this is how it should go. It's like I'm like everyone else. I'm watching things unfold, and I know that there's great power stuff going on here.
If I can just be honest with you, in New Delhi, we have not had the culture of protest, or the culture of silent demonstrations has been slowly and slowly obliterating away. And when you came to speak, there were more than 2,000 people who came to attend. And it was the first time when so many of us could gather together at one space without an intervention.
I heard something like this, and I heard that it was very difficult to do anything. I just went along for the ride, and I'm glad people were able to gather without intervention. I'm very glad to hear that.
Yeah, there were more than 2,000. I don't know how many hours you spent on book signing, but I was not expecting, and most of them were youngsters.
Yeah.
Yeah, most
But I
of
think
them
there's a
were.
hunger. I mean, even in Europe, because I've done a bit of promotion work in France based on this book, War on Gaza, their version of it. And people in line were coming up to me and saying, "I'm really glad you spoke up." Because everyone's afraid. Even in the West, they're afraid to speak. Like you say, they can get canceled. Uh, there are implications at their workplace. I mean, in Germany, you can barely say a word about this. You know,
Germany is another case of.
well, Germany is like I feel sorry. I know a lot of Germans. I kind of feel sorry for them. They tell me you can't really say anything publicly. So when someone comes and is able to speak, it's clear that there's a hunger for it, and it's clear that what a lot of speech is being suppressed.
Yeah.
That's going on in India. It's going on in the United States. It's going on in many parts of Europe.
Yeah, one thing which was very, in your work, which I really find it very, I think it was the first time it was done, was to shift the focus on the ordinary lives, the real everyday lives of the Palestinians in occupied territories. And a similar work like that has been done by Matthew Teller, who is a UK-based BBC journalist, and Mahmoud Moona, who is a writer and a bookstore owner in Jerusalem. It's called Daybreak in Gaza, and the book has real-life accounts of Gazans. And that was another, very heartfelt conversation that we had. But trying to lighten the mood, do you think that Trump is going to give you a tough competition when it comes to caricature?
I mean, in some ways, he's a caricaturist's dream. I mean, I think I'm going to do a bump volume 2,
Yes.
and Trump will be part of it. But you have to be careful because in some ways he's too easy. I would rather go after really someone like Joe Biden or Kamala Harris because they're hypocrites and they are part of a wider problem. Trump is a specific megalomaniac, I think, that he can be sort of sometimes he's easy to separate from U.S. policy. We'll say, well, that's just Trump, but actually, he's part of it. He's part of something bigger. If I look at Trump, I don't want to look at him as divorced from the American project. He is just a symptom of something, I think, and a dangerous one. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. A really dangerous figure.
Yeah.
But he's sort of the tip of a spear. But there's the spear too behind him.
Yeah. Joe Biden was seen with Rashid Khalidi's book, 100 Years of War on Palestine, and Rashid Khalidi's son is like, "Don't you dare touch that book."
I'm sure someone put it in his hand and said, "Okay, let's take a picture to make it look like you understand the other side." Even someone like Rashid Khalidi really knows what he's talking about. So I don't believe it's I'm sure that's manufactured.
Yeah, and the fact
Image
that
like
Rashid Khalidi has retired from Columbia University, has resigned actually.
right, absolutely, and like, you can see why.
Yeah, it is something which is, and his recent comment on the axis of resistance was so politicized, even though he was trying to speak from a neutral perspective. And the entire context of it is very, all the best from 20th of January onwards to you.
Thank you very much. Looking
You-
forward to what's going to happen.
yeah,
You know, there's always a sense of doom. There was a sense of doom when Trump took office last time, and I think for 2 weeks, I was just flabbergasted at what he was doing. But at some point, I realized he was almost trying to shock everyone who didn't like him. Like he decided he was going to be the bull in the China shop,
yeah,
and he was going to freak out all the liberals and all the progressives and all the leftists, and he did. He managed it. But at some point, I realized, you know what? This is his theater, and part of theater is being a participant in it. And if you're, it's better to take a step back sometimes and not listen to him every day, because then you're just going to be so overwhelmed. I know friends of mine who are just tearing their hair out in despair, and I'm thinking, okay, it's going to be bad, but come on, let's just grow up a little and not get dragged into his space.
yeah,
That's what he loves it when you're freaked out.
yeah.
Just take a step back and be a little more cerebral about this.
Yeah, I mean, what do I say? So, one of our students, Anurag, is asking a question, which is that with the emergence of artificial intelligence and deep fake, how do you, first of all, what is your relationship with technology?
Very limited. In fact, even doing this, I realized I hadn't plugged in my computer, so I have literally 2% on my battery. So that's how good I am with technology.
Okay.
I don't even use Photoshop. I don't know how to
Wow.
use Photoshop. And I'm not saying that as a I'm a little ashamed and embarrassed by it, but I've never just taken the time. I don't know how to use color. I mean, there's ways you can scan things and use color with using Photoshop, but that's why I do black and white, because it's like the path of least resistance. AI is probably going to take away a lot of illustration work if we're talking about that sort of thing, because it's just easier for an editor to say, oh, I'd like something drawn in the style of this, and this artist. And okay, within seconds, something comes out. And oh, well, actually change this, make this figure younger, make this one a bit older. Very quickly, we'll end up in a world where illustrators won't really be needed. And I don't say that with any, I mean, that actually really troubles me. But what's also interesting about AI and deep fakes is when you're drawing, people already know it's a drawing. People already know it's a subjective expression. Now, when you look at a photograph, you don't know anymore. Is this really a photograph of something that was in front of the camera's eyes, or has this been manipulated? Drawings are manipulation, so you already know that going in. So in some ways, we're not losing any currency as drawings.
Yeah.
Drawings don't lose any currency, but photos do, unfortunately. Even film does, and even voice recordings do at this point.
Yeah, it is. And I wonder what Banksy thinks about AI and deepfake. It's good that he has kept his identity hidden, like kudos to him. And but the entire fact of the matter is that uh, you know there's so much of change that is happening in terms of the late stage of capitalism, or I don't know how many stages this stage will have.
Have you
Um,
noticed that late stage of capitalism keeps getting later and later and
Later and
later?
later, yes, yes, it does
I don't.
because it just
I think whoever coined the term late stage of capitalism, I think, was being a bit of an optimist.
yeah, I hope so. I don't know. It's complete. It gets worse and more exploitative and much more dialectically claustrophobic for existence. and it just doesn't end. At the same time, there's so much like we are this fourth industrial revolution or information revolution, or we love putting neat strategies and hierarchies into knowing where we are and
Right.
how we are. But with this, I would request my friend Somesh. Do you want to ask anything to sir?
Not specifically. I just wanted, because I reference your work a lot when I'm teaching visual storytelling to my students. And what I really appreciate in your work is the use of how do you put yourself as a character in the middle of all the investigative stuff that you're doing. Specifically, how you choose to be as a third person. Specifically, there's one particular shot in a book where you're looking over at the city, and while you are in all black and white, the rest of the city is in grayed out area. And somewhere I think it highlights that it's important to have that understanding of the gaze. What gaze are you putting at the people you're talking to or the city you're looking over? And I think I find it interesting because it tells that while you're there, you have your own biases and understanding, and anyone who goes to do this kind of a stuff has always to take their time before. And that's another thing with the drawing is it's extremely politically flattening in some way, because unlike a photograph which you can just go and swoop in and take it, although a good photographer always brings the camera out much later, a drawing or a sketch is extremely participative in that sense, because the person you're drawing can choose to not be at it anytime they want. So it's not just that you're going to be there and you draw them and you've captured them. It's up to them that whether they're going to let themselves be drawn into your sketchbook or not. So I think apart just using drawing as a tool, and I think how you make it very clear that you are just a part of the things finding out and you're not the authority on this. I think it's a very important thing, because somewhere I think we need that kind of a perspective and understanding that we all have to find our own version of the truth here. So
yeah, I never wanted. Yeah, I thank you for that. Thank you for that, Somesh. I've never wanted to think of myself as like some great authority. In fact, when I was studying journalism, I didn't, even when I was studying it, I didn't quite understand how it worked. To me, who are these people who could pronounce this, that, and the other thing? Journalists seemed like flies on the wall that were sort of all-knowing and all-seeing, like some sort of Greek god. When I actually saw how journalism is practiced, it began to feel a little more like meat and potatoes. It's like, okay, this is how it's done. And I became very interested in the seams of journalism and how journalists often didn't know what was going on, had to be told what was going on. And sometimes that led to manipulation, by a fixer's part or a translator's part. There were just a lot more. Anyway, it's just better to approach it with a certain humility, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. No, completely. And especially love the use of perspective in your work, just how you kind of take the little camera in the way of the people you're talking to and how you zoom out of it. I think that's very, very interesting in your work.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much.
There's a huge lot of stuff to talk about, but I don't want to just go on and on.
Okay, well, thanks.
Sir, we both might be looking very calm and relaxed right now. But if we were right now together, we would be jumping and causing an earthquake, not able to process that we actually talked with you.
Well, where do you live exactly?
I stay in Delhi, he stays in Bangalore.
Okay, well, one day, next time I'm in India, we'll all meet and we'll jump and we'll all jump together.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, definitely. So with this, sir, I think you have 1% battery left. And
I do, literally.
Okay. And I'm going to pinch myself after this is over. And thank you so much for the privilege of your time.
Oh, no, it was such a pleasure. Such a pleasure. Thank you for being so interested for great questions. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much.